All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru, and this is Nycos Insider. This episode, we're going to be talking a bit about the geography of Nycos and what kinds of environments and conditions one might experience while visiting Nycos. As you can see on the map here, and I'll put it up where I can show you on the screen at least a basic idea, you can see that there are fundamentally two continent areas, technically a third. Here is the continent known as Grolantor, and its twin, although slightly different in shape, Yandala over here. Now this upper region kind of is in the visual shape of a unicorn. That is Nordland, but now it's fundamentally part of Yandala. The origins of Nycos actually date someplace in, I guess you'd say, a long time in the future compared to Earth, because the very nature of the world is of a magical one, and we wouldn't want to get too far into the weeds of how magic works on this world, so I had to create a place where it would work elsewhere. Pardon me for looking over to the right on occasion. That's where my video screen is, and I haven't yet set it up where I can see whether or not anybody's online with me or not. So I don't even know why I told you that. Anyway, the geography of Nycos actually starts with its location in space, if you will. As I mentioned in a previous episode when we were talking about the cosmology of Nycos, the world itself is a moon of a gas giant, a small spheroid hurtling about at a ridiculously high rate of speed, rotating on its axis every roughly 24 hours just to make gameplay easier, but orbiting its mother planet, the gas giant known as Nimbus, in just over 30 days, which means it's moving at an extremely high rate of speed as it passes around the world. Gravity is maintained more by magic than by physics. I'm sure that any mathematician out there would take one look at my numbers and say that's not even possible, but hey, it's a fantasy world. Primarily the oceans of Nycos are a form of salt water. The chemical composition has never been analyzed scientifically. Suffice it to say, there are myriads of life forms that live in its oceans, as well as in the air above the planet's surface. The physics of Nycos were altered sometime during I believe it was the third iteration, and the sea life was afforded the opportunity to take flight and actually live in the fluid environment of the air, disregarding the physics of their gravitational effect. In other words, fish can fly, whales can fly, jellyfish can fly, and the mechanics of it be damned. It's kind of a fascinating place to be. The element of the atmosphere that allows for flight is the very element that is derived directly from the ambient energy expression from Nimbus itself. That is what I have termed to be magicals, like as in particle, ICLE instead of ICAL at the end. And these magicals affect literally every living thing and every material thing that is Nycos on an ongoing basis. With that in mind, the climate, if you will, of the arable portions of Nycos, that is the places where people actually can live, span from a very deep Arctic region near the northern polar region and extending down to tropical regions and very arid desert-like regions as you approach the equator. Now, as I showed you on the map, there are simply the two continents, and they are both above the equatorial line, and fundamentally wrap around the upper hemisphere. Therefore, the maps, of course, have the same problems with any two-dimensional application. They're more for practical use of determining distances between places and situational, locational identity, basically putting places where they are next to and things like that. It's kind of like what has been attributed to Einstein about time, that everything happens, that time exists so that everything doesn't all happen at once. The same thing is kind of true geographically. A map fundamentally tells you how far apart things are and then ascribes a value to those somewhat arbitrarily, since the curvature isn't taken into account in a flat map. That having been said, when you are looking at a map of Nycos, the extreme colds of the northern part of the planet are still, for the most part, survivable. There are life forms that have learned to live on the permafrost of cryopathia that have evolved specifically to take advantage of the extreme cold, the extreme whiteness, and the abject absence of interference. Plant life takes many different forms as well, and although the majority of cryopathia is cloaked underneath an entire sheet of ice, there are pockets where geothermal activity have erupted, giving rise to fundamentally the equivalent of oases in the desert, places that pop up that are thermally warmed from within and can support various forms of life. These locations are fairly widely distributed because the peoples of the Northlands have developed fundamentally ice-going technologies. In other words, monstrous vessels that are on skids or skis and travel either at the whims of the winds, large sailing vessels, yes, the equivalent of prairie schooners, actually with ice blades on the bottom, ice riggers and things like that, cantilevered vehicles that put their weight on ice and then utilize wind or magic to traverse the spaces. The type of life that forms in those areas is quite varied. There are forms of hunter creatures as well as monsters that actually live off of the sea-going and therefore airborne-going sea life that normally wouldn't be able to survive in such a place, but here magically they do. Along the coasts of those regions, there are mountain ranges, almost as if it was a boundary against the water. I guess you'd say that maybe somebody designed it that way, but the outer rim or the outer walls of cryopathia fundamentally act as stalwarts and bulkheads against which the ice forms, and are maintained and propagated both by the creatures that support that kind of weather pattern, the ones that live in the ice, but also those who are prefer the heights. They tend to take isolated existence along these mountain ranges. Such monstrous creatures as white dragons or entire clans of giants, monstrous ocean-going worms, and so on, all live along those mountain ranges. To the west of cryopathia, immediately adjacent to it, is an area that's known as, in the past was known as Dragonbone Pass, and is currently known as Mornglade. I'll show you a quick look again. The ice realms are up here, and then this V-shaped area here is known as Mornglade, and it is an ancient and pretty much frozen over forest, and yet snow very rarely falls there. The cold that maintains it is on the basis of several rather hideous creatures that live in the Mornglade. The rumors about what might be there are extensive. There have certainly been sightings of a monstrous, gigantic lich of a dragon, or at least possibly an undead dragon that lives in that area. Further, there are something known as the Coldmen, and these icy devils, if you will, tend to be raiders. If the weather becomes too warm in their realm, they'll actually move down and extend the icy regions by fell magics that they bear with them. Finally, the third of the great dangers of the Mornglade are the spirits of the damned. There's a legend that a king marched an army specifically into the cold in order to let them die on the basis that he was fulfilling a promise to a nemesis who had threatened his personal family. And so the souls of the deceased now are said to haunt that region in mass. In other words, there are said to be armies of the undead that walk through that region, still looking for vengeance against the king who sent them there to die. Once you get beyond Mornglade and move into the Badlands, from basically the edge of Mornglade all the way to the Great North Sea, there are areas that are collectively known as Shun Trua. It's an area that has been, I guess you'd say, culturally appropriated by a very prolific and fecund race of Rook who specialize in raising and training and utilizing the resources of giant grass spiders. These 18-foot long spiders have mechanical capabilities such as extreme speeds across open terrain, the ability to jump 30 to 60 feet in a single leap, both vertically and horizontally. That these grass spiders communicate with each other through a piping sound. The armies of Shuntrua, therefore, if driven to action, tend to amass large numbers. We're referring to 6,000 to 10,000 of these Spydrin warriors mounted on these grass spiders. And their equipment is built for speed and agility. They utilize the spider's silk to make hardened forms of armor. They've made weapons and bowstrings and such out of the material, and actually use the chitin of the spiders that have passed to create their actual weaponry, sharpened knives, bows, spears, and the like. And among this great force, the legend is that there are 1,000 warriors dedicated to Shuntroa that are called the Spirit of the Nine, and this fighting force operates and is known as the Gildan Tide because the spiders that they raise in particular are of a breed of grass spider that are yellow gold in color, which they then amplify with adornment and tattooing and such to make truly fearsome. And that these forces then drive creatures ahead of them. Now, I'm getting way ahead of myself, and the only reason why I mentioned the physicality of this is that the geography of Shuntroa, while it is a badlands and steppes area, it's also fully riddled with various spider lairs, nesting areas. there in the heights there are said to be web towers that have been constructed that create a truly alien visual experience when you see them. And at its height, the Chantroa kingdom was one of the 9 wonders of the world, and to this day is still a great location for adventurers to investigate and seek out treasures from the earlier times and iterations. Good point. And the question about living things on the ice, switching back to that just a second. The creatures on the ice cover a lot of different types and styles, and arguably one of the most terrifying are the polar orca. These are fundamentally killer whales, if you will, that have modified their physical material, their external skin, to be a very thick fur that is sleek and smooth and moves really well across the ice. Silently, they propel themselves across with their fins. Imagine, if you will, the concept of the bulette species that's farther to the south, the land sharks, and imagine them large enough to, for example, swallow or nearly swallow an ice rigger kayak or something at one bite. These horrible beasts tend to stay in the lowlands, and although they theoretically are capable of flight, actually prefer to live along the surface of the ice and tend to follow the rifts and valleys after prey. Their coloration varies. There are rumors of entirely white species and even a rare bull among them that's said to be ice blue. And these tend to hunt in packs. So generally, if you see one, there's a dozen or more nearby. They're not necessarily something you would want to run into, and ice riggers actually take great pride in their ability to outrun and outmaneuver even these horrible ice creatures. I knew you'd love those. The moving south out of Mornglade rather than across to the west, if you go south, you'll be going into the upper parts of Grolantor continentally. This area has been fought over for centuries, millennia even, because it is the gateway between the continents, and those who control the highways and roads of this midsection of the world tend to be the most profitable business-wise because they have access to resources that the other nations simply can't get to without that passage. Certainly, people have been known to cross what's known as the Black Waters, those areas where there are no astronomical signs that can be used for navigation. But this midland, this area that's currently being held by Eldrasar, is this small land bridge here. Wrong side there. And while a lot of traffic, a lot of cargo transits south along either of the continents directly, that land bridge into Eldrasar has been fought over forever. The current area administration, if you will, has been very lackluster. It's currently under the area of the King of Florin, but the Florentine army, Florentine nation fundamentally was driven into exile when Florence fell at the end of the last age, and therefore in the modern iteration, the city-states of Eldrasar operate without governance from their fief lords, if you will. The only one of real note is in the areas in the southern mountain range of Mornglade, and that's known as cauldron, and that's mainly because the city was built on the inner wall of a caldera of a defunct, or out of functioning, if you will, volcano. And the other city of note that's formerly of the Florentine Empire is now is the city of Eldrasar, which is the city upon which the name of the nation is defined. As a burgeoning city-state, Eldrasar did have one of the best standing fleets and patrolled the borders east and west of the peninsula, trying to slow or at least interfere with cargo transits that were headed beyond their borders. And they were fairly effective during the last iteration, as they made several really good deals with the Quorumite government. And we'll talk about Quorum here in a moment. Pardon me for a second. Yay, satisfying sound. Caffeine being opened. Anyway, so this area of Eldrasar is, for the most part, under defended. There are many, many miles of open terrain that can be used for landing craft along the coasts, as the waters there are fairly shallow. In particular, vessels will actually cross the North Sea Blackwater, simply because if you sail any direction long enough, as long as you're able to hold your bearing, you will come out someplace else on the continental coast. Therefore, crews will do well to make sure their vessels are fully stocked before they enter any of the Blackwaters, because the possibility of taking longer to achieve your destination is quite high, actually. The irony is that during the periods when the candle is in the air, or before hammerfall, there are things in the skies that can be used as watch points. But now that we are after candlefall and headed towards the next astronomical event, there's really nothing to provide any kind of support for sailing vessels in terms of actual physical visual cues. That doesn't mean that magics can't help, and it doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to navigate, but that's the short of it. Now, as you move along the Quorumite coast, which is stretching further west over the top of the Quorumite continent, this area up here, you'll notice that there are shallows, water that's areas that can be used by vessels to get from place to place relatively easy, and so there's quite a brisk coastal commerce currently operating. Quorum, while it is not an evangelistic nation by any stretch, nonetheless has a wide enough area and enough footholds that the governmental system, which was established in Quorum at the end of the last age, still functions to hold sway, if you will, almost like hold court for all of a nation that is roughly half the size of the United States. So it's a relatively large nation physically. It has virtually no cultural enemies at this point other than other trade nations, and since we are relatively early into an age, there hasn't been as much nation versus nation conflicts along its longitudinal boundaries. This area is a cold steppes-like plain, and while there is some farming, the soil here is fairly rocky, and for the most part the permafrost really prevents long-term growth of large-scale agriculture, if you will. There are a rather extensive number of orchards, however, and they tend to be tended by individuals who are in their realms for the long haul. Some of the greatest vineyards of the planet are Quorumite, or at least fall under the protection and aegis of the Coromite government. The temperatures during the summers can make it up into the 60s and 70s, and sometimes on extreme days into the 80s. But the low temperatures, especially during the winters, can fall to 20 or 30 below. So the people, quite frankly, are hale and hearty and spend a lot of their time in the outdoors. So they tend to be ruddy complected, a little bit on the muscular side, because survival depends on strengths and relatively high constitutions in the area. And while there are individual wizards and sorcerers and mages of different kinds that have carved out a life here, it's far more conducive to the more physical life forms, more physical types of life. Yeah, sponsors, please, Coke. I didn't put the can up because it's got the label on it, so I guess I'd have to do something like this. Here we go. Not that I would use a cola brand that's zero sugar, but I might. All right, so going farther south, going just straight south out of Coram, you're going to come to the Dayan mountain range. It's also known as the Blades of the World. It stretches from the World's Edge range far to the west, all the way to the Fingers of El Sadar, which are near Olmaria, the border of Coram, and the rest of Eldrasar. This mountain range is cloaked in a lot of mystery and distrust, as the Eldrin race that had been occupying that area was virtually obliterated before the end of the last age. There's not a lot of detail to that because of the effects of the Never. However, even among the young races and the mortals, there are rumors that there are hideous insectoid beings and dangerous forms of life that still live above the tree line in the area that the Dayan elves used to live in. Dea, as their nation was known, and therefore it's spelled Daean, pronounced Dayan. The irony is that they were the first of the ancient races to fundamentally fall prey to the other during the last iteration, or no, rather in the sixth iteration. And so the knowledge of awareness of that range has been fundamentally lost. Rumors do persist that there was a nation known as Nyx, and what few representatives of the Nyxian culture that have escaped were basically obliterated during the era of the candle fall. Before the candle actually fell, there was a cataclysm that occurred as part of the candle fundamentally broke apart and fell, and arguably it's the only piece of the ancient lore that actually is. I completely blanked my thought there. That never happens. The few Nyxians that remained say that the fall of that nation was directly related to an object that collapsed and destroyed all of that which was. Several expeditions have been made to go to that area, and to this date, there's no record of any of them succeeding in finding any survivors of that nation. Rumors are that it was the last Sylvan location on Nycos, But, of course, rumors will persist that such stories are nonsense and that there are other ways to come in contact with the ancient Fae. Suffice it to say that there are other secrets and rumors that are hidden in those mountains that have yet to be discovered. The mountains are covered with ice and snow and are fundamentally dry solid rock above fundamentally the tree line at about, I think it's about 20,000 feet. I don't remember, I have to go look. But the area of this mountain range does climatologically get down to the temperatures that are common in cryopathia, but also there's a lot of volcanic activity in the mountain range that does create hot spots and virtual paradises even in the depths of that ancient and terrifying cold. Moving inward from Eldosar, moving southbound into the base of Grulantor, there's a place that literally you go up to go down. The nation is known as Trill, and Trill has one of only two open accesses from the surface into the Everdark. There's a monstrous valley within the Trill region that's known as the Eversmoke, tied to the Everdark, where volcanic activity has been operating nonstop since before the end of the age, and completely fills this specific valley on a daily basis with heavy, thick, smoggy-like smoke. It's difficult to breathe in the area, and lighting is reduced. Nonetheless, there are cavern entrances within that valley that open directly into the more commercial parts of the Everdark areas, and fundamentally the majority of characters who come from an Undran background can generally track their lineage back to this valley in Trill. The climate there is extremely warm, as the geothermal activity around this valley has to be high for there to be so much smoke being produced. But the people of Trill also claim to have access to some of the ancient Eldrin knowledge from the Highlands, which suggests that perhaps the Trill the Undran have actually mounted expeditions to climb up into Daya, but that has not been verified by any specific eyewitnesses. Oh, yeah. Thanks for asking. The Blade Mountains, you'll see it as a brown shape running from here all the way across. And you can see the spaces in there that indicate that there are forested areas in the heights that might be still accessible if you could only get an airship to stay afloat in those dangerous and spiky mountains, if you want to call it that. Hence the name Blades. So beyond Trill, going south. Going south this direction, you come across an area known as Dolgum. And Dolgum's the only place where the Urgluk reside. And the Urgluk are a giantess race. They're separate from what we now know as the Goliaths, and are less civilized, more savage, and do have within their realms all of the different types of giants that you might expect. Ironically, the Urgluk governmental system is in no stretch any form of fiefdom or monarchy. They are individual tribes and bands and such, and so there's almost constant warfare in Dolgum. For this reason, there are quite a few mercenaries among the giantess tribes that nations can hire, but generally they're so mercenary, so requiring of high pay that it's almost impossible for an individual to actually hire them. But because of their wealth, because of the amount of treasures that the people of Dolgum have amassed over the iterations, over the span of existence, they are a ripe target almost all the time for raids, and for this reason, quite a few different adventuring groups end up cycling into the engagements with the giants at some point. They are farther from the mountain range, and therefore the climate is beginning to, you're coming down in elevation as well, so the climate's become more amenable. There are fairly decent human populations within the zone, albeit in protected and in some certain cases somewhat cloistered or isolationist locations. Oceanic traffic on the inland sea is almost hunted out of existence by the Eldrasani. The southern coast of the peninsula is far more to their liking, and so therefore they spend more time clearing that area of opposition. It's interesting to note, therefore, that across the inland sea from Dolgum is a developing kingdom known currently as Dragonia, for lack of a better term. And its peoples are fundamentally dragonborn and those who have dragon lineage. And they are far less judgmental, perhaps, than other human population species areas, because they embrace the idea of their draconic heritage and are seeking to reestablish a homeland for all dragon kind. The danger is that their governmental system is fundamentally being driven by those of the lawful evil alignments. They certainly have as their agenda the cleansing of those who are impure and things like that, trying to return the dragons to their once well-established finery, albeit perhaps in less than altruistic ways. Dragonia, therefore, is just along the coast on the other side of the inland Black Sea, and it's would be considered part of the Swarthir governmental system, but the put a comment in there. That's pretty funny. It's my using a lot of verbal commands on my phone lately. The Swarthir plains, which start this north and are almost like a steppes area at this point, descend rapidly along the inner coast of Yandala and end up in the far south, the area known as the Swarthir Savannah, being very close to jungle climate, very hot and arid, and the control of Swarthir falls to individual nomadic tribes, and there is no established Swarthir government. So armies and larger groups of pilgrims, nomads, and such like will cross Swarthir to get to other places, and therefore there are quite a varied number of possibilities of encounters and such across the Swarthir plains. Let's see. We're almost out of time and I haven't finished everything yet. Let's go a little bit south quickly. Moving down through the Dian Mountains from the Blade Range, you come to a secondary range known as the Grimhalt, and that's that diagonal mountain range. And it is universally held to be the realm of the Grim. There are holds and palaces and cities and processing centers and all kinds of activity for the Grim population along the Grimhalt. And it's pretty isolated from the other races, with the possible exception of some influence from the elevations, as the Elves of Arios, who live on Yandala, which I guess we'll have to cover next time, as the those Elves of Arios are making their moves into unoccupied territory in the elevations. As the Elves of Dea fell away, so therefore the terrain opportunities for the area Elves of Arius increased. The Elves of Arius are the race known as Primus, and their moves have been rather aggressive of late, as they even tried to make a move against the ancient city of Neomoria. The last thing I kind of want to cover here is there are 2 points of interest in the far south, and we've clearly passed over a lot of different types of terrain here. But in the far south, along the coastal region of Grolantor and of Yandala, are positions of extreme elevation where the mountains seem to have reached towards the sun, towards the stars, as if to be a place for dragons to meet and whatever. To the south of Grolantor is a place known as Tiora's Watch, and in the south of Yandala, a place known as Cywin's Calling. And these two places historically have been significant for both the dragon populations, but also for those that would face against the dangers of the other, the things that proceed out of Candlefall and Hammerfall. Both of those are, of course, terms that are fundamentally meaningless in the current iteration, but there are many of the races that have opportunities for players and adventurers to actually discover the answers to the secrets of when these things might be and what will be the signs of their coming. I've got literally 2 minutes left for the end of this episode, so I want to thank all of you that have been watching today. Those of you that are watching in the future, those that appreciate our live streams, make sure you catch up with us tonight, 6 p.m., Winds of the West. That's Winds of the West tonight at 6. On Wednesday, Cauldron Triumphant. On Friday, the Fellstone Chronicles. And, of course, Sunday is Whispers on the Mists. Thank you for watching. Appreciate your attention, and I hope we've given you some information you can chew on while you're watching our streams on the other shows on Nycos D&D. Thank you for your time. Have a great day. This is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru. Oh, make sure you subscribe below and click on the bell button so you get updates and information when we're doing our stuff, because you don't want to miss out. Thanks for watching. This is Jonathan Alvin, the Game Market Guru.